Okay, welcome back, everyone, for Chapter 14, Economic Transformations, Commerce and Consequence, 1450 to 1750. And we're going to start Chapter 14 in these economic transformations with Europeans and Asian commerce. Remember, this early modern period is an excellent period as we look at political, economic, and cultural transformations and so many different changes that are going on. The trade and commerce form a critical part of the study of world history through all the major periods of this course. But in the period from 1450 to 1750, these expanding trade networks became truly global for the first time. And Western Europe emerged as a major player, finally, in international trade. Okay, let's look at this first image here. Who are the men in this painting, and where are they? Well, this painting shows 3 Africans and a European, presumably in Africa. Specifically, this 18th century French painting shows the trading port of Gorin in what is now Dakar in Senegal. The vegetation in the background is the suggestion that this is not, or this is a location outside of Europe. The African man on the right, look at him wearing his shirt. He has a lance, smoking a pipe, or at least has a pipe. The 2 African figures to the left are wearing just their loincloths. And one is holding what looks like a bottle, maybe of some sort. And around their necks are rings that are, you might think they're necklaces, but given that their feet are shackled together, it is more likely that these are used to chain or tie them up. And that would mean these 2 men here are slaves. And so based on their dress, the European seems pretty wealthy compared to the others. So what are the men in the front of the painting doing? And what about these 2 here in the back? Well, the African man holding the lance, which could be an illustration of his force over the slaves, looks like he's engaged in negotiations with the European trader over the sale of the 2 Africans. Neither man is looking directly at the slaves, and they're only pointing their hands at them. And meanwhile, the slaves on the left look scared and confused, upset, and very unsure of their fate. So what impression does this painting convey about the slave trade in Africa? And the painting suggests a willingness of Africans to engage in the slave trade themselves. It also shows the callous disregard for human lives involved. And note the negotiating parties' complete disregard for the slaves in the background. At the same time, the shackled slaves look rather meek and submissive, a characterization that just does not do justice to the men and women sold into slavery in the Atlantic trade. Okay, first we're going to talk about Europeans and Asian commerce. So Atlantic trade was and is enormously significant. The slave trade was only one part of the international trading networks that shaped the world between 1450 and 1750. The Europeans finally broke in the Indian Ocean spice trade. During this time, American silver allowed greater European participation in the commerce of East Asia, and fur trapping and trading completely changed commerce and the natural environment. Europeans were increasingly prominent in long-distance trade, but there were other peoples who were also important. And commerce and empire were the 2 forces that drove or fueled globalization during our early modern period, 1450 to 1750. Let's continue here. Europeans wanted commercial connections with Asia. Remember, Columbus and Vasco da Gama both sought a route to Asia. Motivation above all was the desire for spices. There were other Eastern products that were also in demand. European civilization had finally recovered from the Black Death. National monarchies were learning to govern their kingdoms more effectively. Cities became major international trade centers. Even the problems of the old trade systems from the Indian Ocean Network began to show. Muslims controlled the supply, which wasn't good for Europeans. Venice in Italy was a chief intermediary for the trade with Alexandria in Egypt, and many of those other states in Europe resented that because the Venetians became very wealthy as the middlemen here, and could charge, because they controlled this air, they could charge the prices they wanted. The Europeans desired to find Prester John and enlist in his support in the Crusades. Last of the Crusades here were in the early modern period, and there's also a constant trade deficit with Asia. Well, let's first talk about the Portuguese Empire of Commerce. So the Indian Ocean commerce was highly rich, diverse. The Portuguese, they didn't have goods of a quality for effective competition, so they took to piracy on the sea lanes. The Portuguese ships were more maneuverable. They also carried weapons. So despite their economic weaknesses, they had military strengths. When the Portuguese made it into the Indian Ocean and entered the Indian ports, they soon discovered that their goods were not in demand. And they didn't have the cash to buy the Asian items that they wanted. So the Asian ports and the Asian economy as a whole were much wealthier than the Portuguese or other European economies. However, they also realized that the Indian Ocean trade was generally unarmed. So they used their easily maneuverable ships and cannons to attack merchants and ports, and taking what they wanted and establishing a series of ports for themselves as bases. And they established fort bases at some rather key locations: Mombasa, Hormuz, Malacca, and Macau. These Portuguese-controlled ports in East Africa, the Persian Gulf, India, Southeast Asia, and China, that gave the Portuguese entry into the Asian economy. But it also served as a naval base for them to even pursue those goals. And the Portuguese were able to create what's called a trading post empire. Their goal was to control commerce, not territories or populations, and they operated by force of arms as opposed to economic competition. And at their height, they controlled about half of the spice trade to Europe. Unlike the Spanish annexation of large tracts of land in the Americas, the Portuguese only seized this string of ports, creating what's known as a trading post empire, which is rather different. From these ports, they tried to create a monopoly by forcing merchants at the barrel of a cannon to buy a cartaz pass. And while this did make the Portuguese wealthy, they never established anything near the complete control of the Indian Ocean trade. Only about half. The Portuguese gradually assimilated to Indian Ocean trade patterns. They carried Asian goods to Asian ports. And the Portuguese settled in Asian or African ports. But their trading post empire developed into a steep decline by 1600. And so, even the Portuguese realized that the money was not to be made in exporting goods to Europe or selling European goods, and definitely not, trying to sell those, but by becoming a player in this already existing Asian trade network. And because it was mostly Portuguese men that traveled to the Indian Ocean, they quickly married Asian women, and that produced a new Luso-Asian port culture. And despite many successes, the trading post empire was poorly run, and that's why it declined in sometime after 1600, just as other European powers began to make real efforts to move into the Asian trade. And here is a map showing you the territory under Spanish control in green, Dutch control in purple, and then Portuguese control in orange. And this is this is great how involved the Europeans got. All of these little squares that you see are European trading posts. So they were eventually they became heavily involved in the Indian Ocean trade. They were late getting to the party, fashionably late, albeit, because this network had been going on for centuries. But this gives you a visual on where everything is located and which European countries had control where. All right, let's talk about this image. So what are the people in this painting doing? Well, the 6 figures in white cloth draped around their waist looks like they're picking, it could be small blackberries, but actually they are peppercorns. Peppercorn being a spice. The laborers collect the peppercorns to fill the large vat. Here over to the right, where a man in full clothing, lighter skin, has a hat, a dagger. It looks like he's kind of tasting maybe the crop. So what about this image suggests that this is part of the early modern period? How would you be able to look at this and know that this image came from our time period, the early modern period? Well, the white European figure on the right is a new addition to the spice trade, right? These native Africans, Asians, whatever it is, they weren't new. This had been going on for centuries. But he's new to this party, right? So, it had previously been occupied, not just Asians, Africans, Chinese, the Arabs, for centuries. And it wasn't until the 15th century that Europeans gained direct access to the spices in the Indian Ocean. So do you think the fully dressed man is a merchant or a slaveholder? And that's a rather interesting question, because the fact that he's wearing a dagger could be a sign that he is willing to force or exercise force to control these workers. But it's also of note that the workers in the fields are both men and women, young and old. And so these two facts suggest that this European maybe wielded the threat of force over the island natives, as opposed to exercising force to control them. Okay, Spain and the Philippines. So, the Spanish were the first to challenge Portugal's control of Asian trade. They established a Spanish base in the Philippines. This was first encountered when Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe 1519 to 1521. Like I said, they posed the first challenge to the Portuguese spice trade. The Spanish saw that the Portuguese began to generate wealth from the trade, and so the Spanish crown renewed their efforts to establish a trade connection with Asia, hence Columbus's initial mission. But Magellan's voyage, which came some years later, albeit ill-fated, but it was an around-the-world voyage, the Spanish had contact now with the large Philippine archipelago. It was ill-fated, just in case you didn't know or you were wondering. Magellan was killed in the southern Philippines, but one of his officers brought the ships, all that were left, back to Portugal by continuing west and back around Africa. But they now had large contact with the large Philippine archipelago. The Philippines were organized in small, competitive chiefdoms, and the Spaniards finally established full colonial rule there. The takeover occurred 1565 to 1650, so it took a long time. But the Philippines remained a Spanish colonial territory until 1898, when the United States assumed control. This is a rather long time, so it's over 300 years. The islands had no central government, and the Spanish came in with force and the pageantry of the Catholic Church. They were able to win over many of those local leaders, and the result was a relatively peaceful conquest. Spanish were extremely successful in spreading the Catholic faith, which did lead to some disputations of traditional Filipino culture, especially for women, and their ritual and healing roles were attacked by the Spanish, and that push toward the larger settlements and out of those isolated villages and the church. There was a major missionary campaign that made the Filipino society the only major Christian outpost in Asia. The Spaniards were the ones that introduced forced relocation, tribute, taxes, awful unpaid labor. And those large estates that were established and built, they were just for the Spanish settlers, the religious orders, and maybe some of the Filipino elite. But a vast majority of the people were the ones that were forced to relocate, pay tribute taxes, and forced to work without pay. Manila, a major city of the Philippines, eventually became a major center with a rather diverse population. This port city in the northwest of the Philippines became the focus of Spanish activity. It's located close to the ports of southern China, and actually about 20,000 Chinese came to live in Manila, and at times there was tension over their poor treatment by the Spanish, resulting in revolts and massacres, such as the one in 1603, where about 20,000 Chinese were killed. But there were some periodic revolts by this Chinese population. And also here, Islam was an ideology of resistance. In the South, the merchants had recently introduced Islam to the people on the large island of Mindanao. And as this area resented Spanish rule and the spread of Catholicism, Islam served as their ideology of resistance. Okay, let's look at the East India Companies. The Dutch and the English both entered the Indian Ocean commerce in the early 17th century and very soon displaced the Portuguese and then also competed with each other. But around 1600, the Dutch and the English organized private trading companies to handle their Indian Ocean business. Merchants invested, they shared the risks, they were able to raise money, and the British and Dutch East Indian companies were chartered by their respective governments, which they felt gave them legalizing power to do all that they did. They had the power to make war, govern conquered peoples, and even make their own money. So these organized monopolies represented a new threat to the Iberian trade in Asia. The Northwestern Europeans benefited from superior organization of their capital resources, as well as their efficient and ruthless military compatibilities. In the 17th century, the Dutch in particular posed a major challenge to Portugal as they forced their way into Asian trade. And eventually, they established trading post empires like the Portuguese did. The Dutch Empire focused on Indonesia, while the English focused on India, and the French also established an East India Company. Let's talk about the Dutch East India Company first. They controlled both shipping and production of cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace. They seized small spice-producing islands and forced people to sell only to the Dutch. And unfortunately, this destroyed the local economy of the Spice Islands, but it made the Dutch very rich. And for a time, they sought to colonize Taiwan through a large-scale Chinese immigration campaign into Taiwan, but eventually lost control to the Chinese. So the Dutch seized The Spice Islands in Taiwan displayed their organization, determination, their ruthlessness when they seized the Spice Islands. And they wanted to set up a monopoly on the production of these goods: cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace. In the Banda Islands, for example, the Dutch killed, enslaved, or starved about 15,000 inhabitants. They destroyed the crops of farmers who wouldn't cooperate with their planned monopoly. But like I said, Taiwan was less successful for the Dutch. The Dutch took control in 1624, but found the local population insufficient for labor. So they really encouraged the migration from China. But through this co-colonization, the Chinese population grew very quickly, and the Chinese expelled the Dutch in 1662, and thus making Taiwan a Chinese province. All right, let's talk about the British East India Company. It was not as well financed or as commercially sophisticated as the Dutch, and so they couldn't exactly break into the Spice Island trade. So they established 3 major trade settlements in India in the 17th century. And the British had to work with the Indians, but especially in the textile trade. So they didn't focus on spices. They really couldn't. So they focused on textiles. Excuse me. Because the Dutch were not only able to take away the spice trade from the Portuguese, but they kept the British out of it. And that forced them to focus their activities on India. The British were faced with the powerful Mughal Empire. They worked with the Mughals and established trading posts at Bombay and Calcutta and Madras, and the British merchants imported cotton textiles for their home economy. Now, they couldn't compete with the Mughal Empire on land, so they had to establish those trading ports. But the British Navy eventually gained control of the Arabian Sea, as well as the Persian Gulf, making them a major player here. And so they did trade some spices, but cotton textiles became much more important. Now, the Dutch and English became involved in carrying trade within Asia, and they both gradually evolved into typical colonial domination. So this carrying trade in bulk commodities, like the Portuguese before them, the British and Dutch discovered that they could make money in the inter-Asian trade, carrying the goods from one place to the other, as opposed to trading, because they really didn't have anything to trade that was of value. So they began to ship bulk items like pepper, textiles, tea, coffee, for a mass market. And later, these trading posts would become essentially formal colonial possessions. Now, let's talk about Asians and Asian commerce. So European presence was much less significant in Asia than in the Americas or Africa. They had no real military threat to Asia. So let's start with the case of Japan. The Portuguese reached Japan in the mid-16th century. Japan, at the time, was divided by constant conflict among their feudal lords called daimyo that were supported by samurai, or their warriors. And because the Portuguese were the first to reach Japan in not until the 1500s, there was limited European contact in Asia. Historians frequently stress the new changes and can forget the existing patterns and continuities. Asian trade remained largely an Asian affair. Europeans only controlled a few pieces of territory in the islands of Southeast Asia, and the powerful states of the mainland had nothing to fear from those small European fleets. Siam, for example, expelled troublesome French missionaries and colonists in 1688, so they had no problems here. And at first, the Europeans were welcome, but Japan unified politically under the Tokugawa shogun, in the early 17th century. And so Japan initially was open, but the Tokugawa shogun closed Japan off from Europeans. And Japan provides an interesting case study in this era. When a civil war among the daimyo lords wreaked havoc in the 6th century, many Chinese welcomed the Europeans as sources of trade, new weapons, even a new faith. There are about 300,000 Japanese that converted to Christianity. However, with a series of military leaders that got the upper hand, they established order under the Tokugawa shogunate, and they expelled the foreigners, executed the Japanese Christians, and even forbid the Japanese from traveling abroad. Only the Dutch, who as Calvinists had little interest in missionary activities, were allowed to enter a single southern port to trade once a year. So all Europeans were banned except for the Dutch at a single site. And so thus Japan was closed off from Europe, for 200 years, 1650 to 1850. The Asian merchants continued to operate despite a European presence. Overland trade within Asia, like I said, really remained in Asian hands, and tens of thousands of Indian merchants lived throughout Central Asia, Persia, and Russia, all controlling the Asian overland trade network. And that sums up section 1. I will see you guys back for silver and global commerce.